This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, let's get started. Thank you very much for your patience while the computer did its usual thing. I'm here on my own today, so Catherine's not here, but she sent someone to keep an eye on me. I don't know if you saw him. He's part of Catherine's family, and he's just making sure that I don't make any mistakes. So, you remember last week I had way too much to cover, and I didn't get really very far into what I was doing, and I vowed to roll that into this week's lectures, which I have done. I guess I'd have to say that you'll be pleased to hear I've cut out a lot of stuff, and I think I've made something that's fairly manageable. And as you know already, probably, because I've probably done it twice already, and if any of you had me in undergrad, you will remember that I do that as well. I cannot conceive that this will last for 2 hours. I cannot imagine this will go for 2 hours. And then it always, I'm up to about slide 10, and suddenly it's like, God, I've got 10 minutes left. So let's see how we go, but geez, if I finish early, you'll be happy, I'll be happy, Alex will be happy, we'll all be happy. So, of course, we've already kind of touched on this, and you will have remember from last week, so many different types of planning that we deal with in the present day. They all have a kind of, I suppose common roots, really. They all have a kind of common origins, and I would say that the common origins are, in large part, they come from a place of social, desire for social change. They come from a place of, social betterment and working for the social good. They are, nevertheless, a kind of a synthesis of that motivation with two pre-existing disciplines, which you'll be very familiar with, architecture and I suppose surveying as well, although possibly also engineering would be, surveying comes out of engineering in a way. So there's if you're going to do a weird kind of, cartoon or diagram or something, you could have those kinds of roots going back into those much older disciplines, and planning becomes a kind of subset of those things, a synthesis of 3 to 4 different enterprises that were, most of which were very alive in the late 19th century. And in the social improvement thing, of course, sociology emerges from that as a motivating, it's a motivating force for sociology, and sociology is such a huge part of planning as well, as you would be well aware. So we have a lot of, fruits on that tree to really torture that poor metaphor half to death. What I would also say, though, is that planning comes initially very strongly out of modernist principles, and modernism is a difficult thing it's a slippery, difficult thing to actually define. But let's say that planning, in large part, comes from a notion. Sorry, I'm still a bit fluey or whatever it was. It comes from a notion of progress. It comes from a notion of scientific application of the appropriate strategies and motivations and principles, particularly principles, that can be applied. And once we get these things right, then we can go forward and make a better world. So there's a strong sense amongst those nascent planners of the late 19th century and their sort of fellow travellers that we need to get we need to get things right, and then we can make things happen. It's just a matter of convincing everybody of the appropriateness of this, and then we can start moving forward. And I don't know about you, but to me, I don't suppose we are really in a postmodern world anymore. We're in a post-postmodern world, but nevertheless, that modernism, that progressive impulse seems hopelessly naive. Not just because the world hasn't been fixed. They have had 130 something years to apply those principles and make it happen, and it hasn't happened. But also because it just seems like there is no solution, in a sense. If any of you disagree, I should set that as a tutorial paper, Solve the Problems of the World in 750 words. I think that's probably, that'd be too easy. I think we'd have to get you to describe how you would solve the problems of the world and then go and do it. And then you might get 10 out of 10. The modernist worldview, this idea of linear progress, scientific and technical knowledge, appropriately applied, rational design, and a control over nature, not just the natural environment, but human nature, all based in scientific understanding. And you can trace this idea back to, I guess, the Renaissance, if not earlier. The Renaissance in Europe in the 15th, 16th centuries, when classical principles were rediscovered and were seen as being, a set of systems that, once again, when applied appropriately, can actually fix a whole lot of issues. You remember last week I talked about Henrietta Barnett. You remember that I talked about her plan to save Hampstead Heath from rampant development, and that plan involved the introduction of the architect planners Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker to create a synthesis of the beautiful open expanse and the suburban development. And you will remember, this is not particularly relevant to today's lecture, but I just want to reinforce it, that this was seen as an extraordinary betrayal by many who were totally absorbed in and in love with the Garden City movement. That if people like Unwin and Parker, who were responsible for the first Garden City, responsible for its design in any case, would then just blithely go along and design a garden suburb, they're traitors to the cause. I don't know how you feel about that as an idea. You probably don't. It's probably a bit late to buy into it, really, isn't it? But nevertheless, that was how it was seen. And you will remember also that I mentioned that Hampstead Garden Suburb is now one of the most highly sought after bits of real estate in London, and I guess probably in a way in the world. All right, so what I want to talk to you about now is a few more key initial interesting players, and then I'm going to segue slowly into talking about how planning as a modernist idea gets applied. Specifically, this week, I'm going to talk about it in terms of colonialism, because I suppose colonialism is a big established fact in the early part of the 20th century, and town planning as one of the new and exciting ideas, the emerging ideas of modern civilization, is brought to bear as a modernising influence on the subject peoples of various empire governments. And some of the the key early planners I'm going to talk about are, you can make up your mind whether they are actually colonial planners or not. I think this guy, there's a good case for him being a colonial planner, but he's not exactly in the same mould as many of the others. He's a gentleman called John Sulman. Sulman he said himself, looks like a Middle Eastern name, but it's actually he thought, some kind of Old English name that just accidentally looked like Suleiman or something like that. He was an Englishman. He was from London. He came to Australia in 1885, by which time he was already a fairly well-known architect. And he had designed a lot of churches in Britain. He came to Australia for the climate. He was sick and his family were all sick. And the doctors said to them, you guys are all going to die if you don't go somewhere a little more salubrious. Probably London was also extremely polluted, wouldn't have helped either. So it was bronchial. I'm feeling it right now. And he'd later claimed, I feel like a lot of Suleiman's testimony is written with hindsight. So he claimed that on a visit to Paris in 1873, when he would have been 24, he became interested in town planning for the first time. So his exposure to Haussmann's recent, redesign of Paris would have actually meant something to Suleiman, if he's to be believed. The fine tree-planted boulevards, he said, and avenues were such a contrast to the narrow streets of London. I determined, when opportunity permitted, to make town planning a subject of special effort. So possibly this is the kind of thing that he was talking about. And a generic picture of Paris for whatever. So he comes to Australia in the 1880s, and he's a well-known architect, and he's kind of forced to come to Australia. So presumably he could have had quite a decent career in the UK if he didn't have these health issues. One of the first things he does, and I guess he's probably fairly moneyed in this early phase. Shortly afterwards, he just to jump ahead with an irrelevant story, he sets up his trade in Sydney, and his partner in his architecture firm runs off to New Zealand with a barmaid and leaves him completely, out of money and having to start all over again. But in this early phase, when he's coming to Australia by boat, of course, he sails around to all the colonial capital cities, and he gives a kind of assessment of each one. And he doesn't like any of them. He's particularly pissed off by Adelaide, and he basically finds them all very unpleasant to look at and spend time in. Sorry about the coughing. Sorry about the inability to use the technology here. Okay. So he says, the placing of public buildings is very haphazard. That the grid plan of all the cities is really disappointing as far as he's concerned, and he's really going from place to place, giving a kind of assessment of each place. I think it's 1890. I think it's the summer of 1889, 1890. Suleiman and his family are staying in Katoomba in the Blue Mountains of Sydney, and Suleiman is asked to give a paper at the Association for the Advancement of Science, which is being held here on this campus over that summer. And he takes the train from Katoomba to Sydney, and Sydney to Melbourne, and he claimed many years later, decades later, he claimed that on the train coming down to Melbourne to give this paper, he wrote his paper, which was called On the Laying Out of Towns, and he talks about specific ways that Australians should dedicate themselves to making a new kind of city in Australia. He's particularly, Katoomba is an inspiration to him in a sense, because I don't know if you guys have been to Katoomba, but it's beautiful, it's absolutely beautiful, but it might as well have been laid out by you know, someone with their hands tied behind their back, and or just someone just like with their eyes closed, like randomly just ruling lines on a page. It's roads in particular go up and down the sides of hills, and it's not at all topographically sensitive, the design of Katoomba. So he claimed later that this was something that he was thinking about. One of the things that Suleiman was proposing around this time and ever after was what he and others called a spiderweb principle for city planning. I think that looking at this now, you would probably say that sort of works. Sorry, the coughing is, I don't know if it's driving you mad, it's going to drive me mad. It sort of works particularly if you have horse-drawn vehicles everywhere, or perhaps people on bicycles or something, but sentient beings going fairly slow that can stop reasonably quickly. And in the motorised age, I'm just going to go on a limb here and say this would be pretty disastrous, or at least you'd need 3 times as many traffic lights as you do now. It'd be incredibly frustrating to get through. I may be wrong. Maybe we should build a model. In any case, Suleiman makes his name in the late 19th century as a town planning expert and a town planning innovator. He does things like this. This is, you may know it if you know Central Station in Sydney. There is a park called Belmore Park there, where he's put a lot of buildings into the park and a ring road for the tramway that joins up with the railway station, and some kind of system of trams coming in and going out. And he's retained some parkland there, but he's also put in a lot of buildings. Much later, only 20 years later, Suleiman contributed a formative design for Daisy Garden suburb, and he ended up being quite important in terms of designing various suburbs around Sydney. Never tremendously successful. He wasn't really that good at it. I don't quite know why, but he was a very important figure at the time, if for no other reason than that he was a strong advocate of planning and always talking about it. He had shares in newspapers and things like that, so he could also, use that fact to be a strong voice particularly in Sydney, but also around the whole nation. In case you didn't know, Australia became a nation in 1901, and we'll get to that important element shortly if I don't collapse. So this was one of Suleiman's final designs, a suburb called Rosebery in. If you go to Sydney, it's on the way to the airport from I guess St Peters or something, and I don't know how much you feel qualified to judge any kind of planned environment, but I personally think this is an awful piece of work from possibly a silly old man. But in any case, it was largely built, and some of it still exists. It's so long ago, it doesn't really, I guess criticism doesn't really matter. So how does the planning, so Suleiman is he's a guy who has come to Australia. He has occasion to go back to Europe and participate in planning conferences and so on. So he is actually, if the well is London or Europe, he's going back to the well on a frequent basis. He feels like he's an equal amongst other planners there, and he has a point. I mean, he's a successful architect and planner, and he's doing quite well. His essential belief, I think, is in what is often known as butility, which is a fairly ridiculous portmanteau word, but I suppose if you wanted to spell it, you'd spell it Beautility. Just the notion of making beautiful places. This is not a good example of that, John. Which would inspire people, you know. And I guess he's coming from a period when there's a strong feeling that there's a moral equivalent between mental health, physical health, being cultured. All of those kinds of things are all part of the same thing. So if you're encouraged to have a kind of a beautiful, see the world as beautiful, and if the world around you is beautiful, then you will become more civilized, and things will, sort of fall into place. You'll be a cultured person. To go around the world, and this is in one sense random, but in another sense I'm a total Finnophile, so I can't not mention Finland, unfortunately, as you come to appreciate. A lot of people in the planning program will go on and on about Switzerland's public transport system. I go on about anything I can relate to Finland. I will. I don't know why. I don't know what happened to me, but a similar example, I guess, is all I would say, where one particular architect planner creates what he sees. He is sponsored or invited to create a garden suburb in Helsinki, right at the end of the tram line, and he creates this extremely beautiful place, which, if I remember correctly, it's a kind of a subset. It's a part of a suburb called Kupula, and the word "poo," no laughing please, means wood. So it's just the wood of Kupula, and I think that relates to the wooden houses, although it might also be the kind of the spacious foresty aspect to the whole suburb. So once again, the story is these are working class people's homes. They're on the edge of town, but they are in a natural environment, and it's should be inspirational to people to have this kind of proximity to nature and to be always able to explore the natural environment. I mean, there's a strong...
It's very hot, be careful.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, that's great, thank you. It's just what I needed. There's a strong impulse at this time in Finland in particular, but you find it quite often in a number of emergent nations, the idea of connection to the land as well, which the British are very big on too, and so are the Australians when it comes to that. Keep going around the world, and we find individuals like John Nolan, who is, all of these people have special quirks. I mean, I guess they're a bunch of men, almost always men, who are in various strange ways find themselves in this new emergent profession. They have no, when they were born or when they were young, and someone said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" None of them would have said, "I want to be an urban planner," because there was no such thing. So Nolan in particular, I gather, when he was born, nobody said anything to him because he was basically an orphan and a foundling. So he was an entirely self-made man who really pulled himself up by his bootstraps, as they say. Nolan, by the time of his death, was America's foremost planner. He was extremely in demand, and he was extremely respected and highly regarded. He did things like, here's a terrible thing, which he didn't do. Here's a terrible thing in an area of Cincinnati known as Fairfax. Nolan went out and surveyed the terrain, and having been sponsored by a wealthy widow in Cincinnati, who wanted not only to make a bit of money with her, from the enormous amount of money she already had, but also was keen to create a model for others to follow in terms of the new science of town planning. He created Murraymont, a new town in the Cincinnati district. And once again, a whole lot of elements that were very revolutionary for the period, but particularly the spaciousness, the accessibility. It's near the actually I think that railroad is not that useful, but there's a streetcar running down here, or there was, and the whole idea is to create a model town that others will follow. Doesn't quite explain why they went with the Tudor look, but that's how they did it. And here you see, artistically and practically planned to the minutest detail. I bet that person's name was not really tag along. So with Mary Emery was the name of the woman, and so Henrietta Barnett style. And I mean, I'm not actually out and out trying to shoehorn the women into the story, but I think that to a degree, if they're around, they should be recognised. She did commission Mary Emery, the wealthy Mary Emery, commissioned Nolan to come and do this work and make this place. The name Marimont is, a kind of a recognition of her first name. And she hoped, if nothing else, to alleviate a little bit of the slum problem and the congestion in Cincinnati itself by creating something on the edge of Cincinnati that was going to be inspirational. Nolan, hundreds of thousands of plans, a lot of replanning for a lot of American cities. This is one that fascinated me in particular for a number of reasons. This is so common in planning experiments of the early 20th century, Venice, Florida. If you have the chance to go to Florida, I would advise you not to go to Venice. There's nothing really there, but probably a few Trump hotels and stuff. But the plan itself, quite gorgeous, I suppose. It's really a holiday home kind of place. It's really you're rich enough to holiday in Florida in winter. You might want to consider somewhere like Venice. Open space, golf courses, linear park or two, and a very enticing. In the time when Florida, as a sort of warmer state, where there's at this time reasonably cheap land, you can see how this would come together. One of the things that I find particularly interesting, and this is weird in a way, is the creation of something called Harlem Village, which is the part, his main Venice here, and his Harlem Village here out in the, a few, I don't know how far, a few kilometres inland. And that is where the African American, I suppose, servants are to live. So they're not living with the rich people who own the main part of the place. They're living in this little, for want of a better word, let's call it a ghetto in the inland there, and they have not much going on. Bruce Stevenson, who's written a lot about Nolan, says this. Nolan placed Harlem Village east of the railway, surrounding it with, in inverted commas, white farms. Segregation was a staple of Southern life, and if Nolan failed to fight the Southern caste system directly, he remained adamant that African Americans received the benefits of good planning. In Venice, like other southern cities, he connected African American neighbourhoods to the larger community via a parkway, that is a freeway, basically. In cities separated by race, interconnected parkways offered the hope of uniting diverse people through nature, in inverted commas, and to Nolan, the brotherhood of man. It's one of those many, many things that I think, and there's more to be said about this, and I'll be saying it in coming lectures, but it's one of those areas where we have to accept, do we have to accept it? We have to accept that historically planning has often been used in the name of things that we would probably most of us now feel were pretty awful things, and we have to also accept, when we look at it at all closely, that planning is still used in that way in many instances, and we can talk about that as time goes on. So Nolan, if Bruce Stevenson, who is who's a great man. I'm sure he wouldn't make excuses for Nolan if Nolan wasn't worth making excuses for. Nevertheless, Nolan was complicit in creating this kind of segregated environment in Florida. Now, here's a guy who I have sort of a deep abiding affection for, and I don't know if he would be similarly easily bought in the same way that Nolan was, all due respect. Patrick Geddes is a Scottish biologist who, and this, you know, a lot of the time these planners, they come from strange and unusual, unexpected places. Geddes was a very keen biologist. He was very interested in, and botanist as well. He was interested in these things very strongly. And he notoriously loved, wherever he went, if he was staying somewhere for a couple of days, he'd make a garden. He was that kind of a person. He was, I'm not even sure if there is that kind of a person, but that's what he was. He had these roots in biology. He had a passion for what he called social evolution. He was very sensitive to different cultures and traditions and the heritage of all the people that he was planning for. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't make what we would now consider to be mistakes, but nevertheless. It was written of him a few years after his death that his ideal of the best life possible was always the best that was latent in a particular site and situation at a particular moment in the development of a particular family, group or community. Not an abstract ideal that could be imposed by authority of force from the outside. And that, I think, is really, really important and useful to think about. That whereas, even at this early stage, or particularly at this early stage, a lot of urban planners at the beginning of the, let's say 100 years ago, are going, yes, okay, we've discovered urban planning, we've discovered town planning. Let's just apply these principles wherever we go. Apply principles of, X% of open space, X density, X, facilities and amenities, and we're right. We'll have everything we want, and this can be applied all over the place. Was often the attitude. Geddes is much more about site specificity. He's saying, before you do anything, go and look at the site, understand the site, and he's also saying, before you do anything, check out the culture of the people who live there already and the kind of place that it is. Before you start trying to improve it, understand what it is that you're trying to improve. You don't just turn up with your recipe book and disperse your ingredients into the landscape. Sorry, that's a terribly mutilated metaphor there, but I think it still sort of makes sense. Geddes does a whole lot of things, and they're just things that make you like him more and more. One thing he does when he comes to Edinburgh, I can't remember where he is in Scotland, a little bit north of Edinburgh, he shows up, he purchases this building, this pre-existing building which he calls the Outlook Tower, and he installs a camera obscura in the top, so you can go up to that little tower up the top there and you can survey the whole of Edinburgh from that spot. It's right next to the Edinburgh Castle. In fact, I think that's the castle there in the background in this image. And he turns it into a kind of a science museum / cultural museum with rather arrogantly, I suppose, unless you're even if you are a patriotic Edinburghian, it gives this element, this sense that there's a civilization reaches its peak at the capital of Scotland, which I don't know, maybe. But this 1892 experiment and kind of institute is really important for the way that people see Geddes and the way that Geddes expounds his ideas. One of the other things that Geddes does, and I guess history does not necessarily record how into this idea his wife was, or even whether he came to regret this decision, I don't know. But he decided at a certain point that he was going to not just sit on the sidelines and prognosticate about the problems of Edinburgh or urbanism or the urban scene or the slums, that he was actually going to get in there and do something about it. And he went in to one of the worst parts of Edinburgh. He, I think, either rented or bought a few top story flats in a row of houses, knocked out the walls and made quite a nice house for himself and his family, but right in the heart of the slums. And he was, following quite a few, something that quite a few people, reformers had done in the past and would go on to do into the 20th century. In fact, the great architect and politician Andrew McCutcheon did this when he moved into a housing commission flat with his wife in Richmond in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s. It's the same kind of idea. It's like, don't just come down from your nice middle-class place with your knowledge and tell people what to do. Be in amongst the people and not only tell them what to do or advise them or whatever, but be one of them and use your knowledge to advocate on their behalf. You're advocating for yourself as well. So Geddes and his wife were living in very, the nastiest part of town in Edinburgh, which, by the way, is an absolutely beautiful city. If you get a chance to go there, I would advise it. It's so wonderful, but that's not the point. He was also asked by the government in Edinburgh whether he could do something about a few parts of Edinburgh in a mass kind of improvement scheme that was going on. And he said, yes, of course. And what he did was, in a couple of parts of Edinburgh Old Town, where I don't have a before picture, I've only got this after picture, which I took myself about 5 or 6 years ago. He chose a portion of the city that had a whole lot of crappy backyards, back lanes, perhaps a few little examples of really local industry. It was just dank and disgusting. And he just cleared it all out and said, this is an open square, where this is where children can play, where older people can recreate. You can see there's a little fountain there, and there's some trees and so on. I don't know. I think the principle still applies. They're probably not Patrick Geddes trees, but you know what I'm saying. He made these where they were cramped and inhumane kind of slum conditions. He at least tried to ameliorate very slightly in that area. So, some of the things that I'm not going to go into Geddes too much more, but I am going to take him into the colonial world a little bit. This is something that Geddes did after the First World War. Geddes had 2 children, if I remember rightly. That's not important. That won't be on the exam. One of them died in the First World War, and Geddes, like a lot of people affected by the war in that way, was totally inconsolable. He was sort of, I think, traumatised and unhappy for the rest of his life. But he had another 20 or so years to go. He travelled a lot in those last 2 decades of his life, and he was commissioned by the colonial governments in India to redesign Indian cities. He was perfect for this kind of thing, in part because he was always on the move, full of ideas, full of always interested in what was going on. He from all reports, loved India. He did this. It was possibly in some ways a little bit ridiculous. He'd show up, he'd look around, he'd talk to people, he'd say, "This is what you've got to do this, do this, do this." Not many of his plans were actually instituted. Nevertheless, what we do get from the plans that he produced for Indian cities is some of those basic elements. His belief in community, belief in the folk, and I guess the sense that the folk were in some ways the same wherever he went. He was very keen to make these kinds of spaces within his blocks, and he was very keen on them partly as community spaces and also as spaces where, for hygiene. So making sure that people weren't too closely, densely packed together. He was very interested in the way that people had used city elements. So he talked a lot about water. I'll get to that in a minute. But he talked a lot about how colonial authorities would turn up to a particular part of town and say, "There's mosquitoes in that body of water. Let's drain it," and deprive thousands of people of a water source, a convenient water source anyway, and not think beyond how has this been dealt with in the past, in the previous, hundreds, if not thousands of years that people have lived here. Local knowledge, I guess, is basically one of the things that Geddes was about. Geddes... Oh, that's much better. Geddes was invited in the mid-1920s to design a new city in what we now know as Israel, which was then Palestine. It was really just an extension of an existing ancient city which was called Jaffa by English-speaking people, is now known as Yaffo. And Geddes, so as we know now, that Tel Aviv is quite a major city. It's not the capital of Israel, but it's the biggest city there, and it's absolutely extraordinarily wonderful city if you ever get a chance to go there. I've been criticised in the past by students for advocating going to Tel Aviv and not acknowledging the awful things that the Israeli government do, and sure, it's still a great city. So Geddes was invited to design this city by the British government, who were colonists here at this time. And he creates something that, when you look at it, you go, well, look, this is doesn't look totally modern. It looks a little bit medieval in a way. It's these winding kind of streets, but you can see a lot of green, a lot of open space. He's designing for a very, arid climate, and a very hot climate a lot of the time. And he's making, there's principles at play here where he's pulling together a lot of. It's in a sense, it's a lot of small communities clustered, cheek by jowl. So each one of these green spaces is a kind of village green kind of idea. And he's, in this sense, who does he look to? He can't really talk to the people that live in Tel Aviv. It's a city that's been created from scratch, and there is a way of life in Yaffo to the south, but it's a new city. But he is applying some of the ideas that he has about how people prefer to live or should live. So when he was remodelling the Edinburgh tenements, he wrote, "Child and student are alike in need of a more hygienic yet beautiful environment, to be reached by their exchanging of the atmosphere of close and street for that of court and quadrangle." And these are the courts and quadrangles that he's talking about. Tree and garden space in open courts, accessed by narrow lanes, which admit shade and quietness. And he's looking to try and rekindle some traditional impulses there about village-style communities. So Tel Aviv, in the very early days of that city's existence in the 20s and 30s, building the place, like it's built on sand, and so on. We'll come back to Geddes, I think, possibly in a little while, but in the meantime, I just quickly want to run through some of our other guys from the early days. Charles Reade is a pretty irascible character, and he has a lot to do with Australia. He was a New Zealander. He went to England as quite a young man, and he gets caught up in he's a journalist. He gets caught up in the town planning movement and becomes a strong advocate for town planning. He comes back to Australasia as part of a lecture tour. And the lecture tour, which I think is 1914, it leads to the announcement of a town planning association in every city that it goes to. So at the end of each lecture that he has, Reade gives a lecture along with a more senior advocate called William Davidge. At the end of the lecture, it must be pre-arranged. It couldn't have been spontaneous. Someone in the audience says, "Okay, well, I propose we have a town planning association in this city," and everyone goes, "Yeah, I'm going to be in that as well." Some of them, actually one of them, the Melbourne one, the Victorian Town and Country Planning Association, exists to this day. The others have all died out, basically in the face of the widespread acceptance of town planning at sort of civic government level. So Reid did a lot of work. He did some work in Australia. He became the first town planner of South Australia, when it was the first time that position was actually created for him. And he does some work there, and he also then goes on to work in what we now know as Malaysia, and also in Zimbabwe. There are quite a few images in the State Library of Victoria that seem to come from Reid and Davidge's town planning lectures, and these are some of the things. We don't really know what the text is, but the images that Reid and Davidge would have been showing. Perhaps the beautiful boulevards of Paris, a little like Sulman. Perhaps they're tapping into the playground movement, which is just emerging at this time. The notion that children will not grow properly, will not grow imaginatively, or will not grow in intelligence unless they have some way, some place that they can go to interact with each other, I guess, and also with their natural environment, with a scientifically devised place that will encourage them to develop in certain ways. So the playground movement, which really locks into the town planning movement at this early time. Reid seems to, it's tough to be absolutely certain how Reid he didn't have planning training, he didn't have architectural training, but he is credited with this famous Adelaide suburb, now known as Mitcham. Okay, moving off Reid, moving on to just someone very local. This is, if Melbourne has someone, a Sulman, it's this particular individual. Tuxen is a Melbourne-born, born in Kew, from Danish antecedents. So his father was Danish, I think. And just in case you care, his first name is completely made up. His parents just made up this name, Saxel, and it's oddly enough, it's been passed on to the firstborn boy of every generation since. So I think they're up to 5 now. I had a little bit of interaction with Saxel Tuxen, the 5th. He was studying at RMIT a few years ago. He wanted to do a study of his this Saxel, and then the people at RMIT told him not to waste time on history. So, but that's the difference, That's the difference. So, Tuxen, this particular Saxel Tuxen, is quite an extraordinary individual in all kinds of ways. He goes into his father's firm. His father is a surveyor. Saxel is a qualified surveyor, and he very quickly aligns himself with the planning movement. He's one of the people at the Reid and Davidge lecture at the Town Hall in Melbourne who stands up at the end of the meeting and says, "I want to be a part of the Town Planning Association of Victoria." And he very notably goes on to serve on the Metropolitan Town Planning Commission from 1923 to 1930. He designed over 50 suburban subdivisions throughout Melbourne, and this is probably not the first, but the first important one. It's up in just north of Preston, or just north of Reservoir, and almost completely, except for this bit on the left here, almost completely built to plan. This is from 1918, so it says 1919 on the slide, but it was launched in 1919 and sold. It was designed in 1918, so it's having its 100th anniversary. For this kind of thing, he went around. I think he probably travelled to Sydney, He certainly consulted every textbook he could to kind of do the best practice planned subdivision, and he used all these kinds of elements. He gave certain centres, sort of zoning in a way, put certain centres. This is the social centre down here, the civic centre, the education centre, and he really went all out with a very crafted and careful piece of work. Very successful very quickly. So he said, inadequate textbooks, a study of different subdivisions, and he said that he was still talking about it 15 years later. So I guess he must have been on some level proud of it. This is a really nice diagram that Tuxen came up with in the late 20s. And this was a very common thing. You see this a lot in in planning texts from 90 or 100 years ago, where people come up with hypotheticals. This is the bad planning style, where I guess it's all the lots are the same size, so it's probably fairly easy to calculate what they're worth. But that said, some of these lots are ridiculously, strangely shaped, so they're not the same size, and they're probably a problem, and they're probably a waste. And then also there's the issue of access to the key things, the railway station on the main road, which is hampered in the adherence to the grid. So what is proposed is freeing up, like that waste space is put together to make recreation spaces for either children or adults, and there is a road scheme that makes it easier to get to the station. There's also, he calls that a business area. It's probably a shopping area. I mean, this is a very common thing to see in transit-oriented development today. I'm sure you're very aware and familiar with this as a concept. It's being replicated time and time again in the present day. I'm not saying that Tuxen is particularly innovative here. It seems almost like it seems logical, but nevertheless, it's apparently some people had to be told. Another of Tuxen's designs. This is very close to the Merrylands estate, and in some ways quite similar. I think one of the main things here is the orientation, the diagonal orientation of many of the streets, which is maximising sunlight kind of idea, I'm sure, although he doesn't necessarily go all out and say so. This was also massively successful. Here's a truly terrible design that just kind of flies in the face of all the things that he was advocating in 1927, and luckily most of this has been obliterated by Chadstone Shopping Centre. But just to add insult to injury in this terrible grid plan, he's given, or someone has given, the names of the famous garden suburbs of England to the streets. Sunlight for Port Sunlight, Welland and Letchworth, the first two garden cities. Arnold is probably Arnold Rowntree, who created Bourneville. Not Bourneville. Another one, can't remember, sorry. And Bourneville is another company town, and Dacey Avenue for Daceyville. So, I hope you're having a good time. So, as we get this procession, here's a couple who were known to Tuxen and who dealt with him. Two Chicago architect planners, landscape architects, Marion Marnie Griffin. They both worked in Frank Lloyd Wright's office. Marion Marnie Griffin was a out-and-out architect. She was the second woman to graduate in architecture in the USA. She was the first to graduate and then to practice. So she was the first woman to graduate and practice in architecture in the USA. And her husband, Walter, was actually, he was a professional architect, but he was also, he saw himself in large part as a landscape architect. He was interested particularly in the natural environment. Here's one of their works, Griffith, in New South Wales, which was confusing because it's called Griffith, but it was designed by the Griffins, and there's no connection between those two facts. Griffith was a federal politician who died, and someone said, we've got to name something after that guy. And the fact that the Griffins were involved has nothing to do with anything. This is a good example of one of Marion's great capacities, which she was a beautiful delineator. She could really do beautiful perspectives of hers and Walter's ideas. Here's another great one that's not so clear, unfortunately, but Mount Eagle Estate in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, I guess, at Heidelberg, and a really attractive. She often did these things on silk. She was quite something. So she'd have to do them she couldn't do any preliminary drawings or anything, and she would just have to start, I suppose, in one corner, I don't know. She'd have to start somewhere and just draw it freehand onto silk, and if she tore the silk, then she'd just have to throw the thing away and start again. Quite a remarkable, it's remarkable even without that knowledge, but it is quite remarkable. Here's a design that the Griffins did in Melbourne with Tuxton. They worked with Saxel Tuxton on this Ranelagh estate down near Frankston, which was a country club estate. You buy a lot here, and you build a house, and you come down, or you'd go down, maybe a few weeks a year, and you were automatically a member of a club there. So in the evenings, you could go to the club, and I don't know what, get really drunk or play cards or whatever. I don't know. I don't know what people did, but that was one of the features of this particular enterprise, the Ranelagh estate. And you will find that Ranelagh is still there and still worth a visit, although a lot of it was not really built until the 50s. Maybe because not a lot of it was not really built until the 50s. Okay, but what the Griffins are really famous for is their plan for Canberra. And this is a whole story in itself, an amazing story. And I guess one of the things that's worth thinking about in terms of Australia and the way that planning has unfolded in Australia is that Australia, being a new nation in 1901, it wants to be good at everything, and it wants to show the way and show that it's a modern place. There's all kinds of reasons why Australia is created in this, why Australia creates itself in this way. One is, sad to say, a somewhat, let's just call it a racist thing. It's like we're a white country here in Australia, and we want to show that we are. It was a common way of talking about things. The best ethnic stock, like the British people, in the best climate, was how people often saw themselves in Australia at the turn of the century. So it was up to Australia. There's always the cultural cringe thing as well, but there's also this thing of like we are actually. This is the opportunity for the best racial stock to, be the best people in the world in this new nation. Totally farcical. But anyway, so Canberra is, to some degree, it's the place that is created to show that Australia, the new nation, is incredibly up to date and modern and important and exciting, and knows what's going on. It's the most woke nation, right? So we have to make this thing. We have to harness this town planning idea that's the new thing that everyone's talking about, and make this capital city that's going to show the world how excellent we are. And when I say we, I'm paraphrasing. I wasn't there, but so there's a competition held in I think it's 1913. It's controversial in all kinds of ways. One way that's controversial is the competition is held to find the best design in the world for the new capital city. It's a huge, of course, that's a career-making thing for anybody. But it's also very controversial because the judging is not going to be by architects. The judging is just going to be by some politicians, So that's problematic for a lot of architects. They're like, well, we're specialists and we need to be judged by specialists, not by, ordinary fools, who know nothing except how to win elections. It's a fair comment, really. And there are other issues as well relating to eligibility and so on. There's I can't remember the details, but there's a wonderful book by Henry Reps called Canberra 1913 that shows you all the plans that were submitted that are still in existence, that are still known to exist. Most of them were thrown away, which is way to keep archives. Australia, but most of them are thrown away, but all the things that were shortlisted were kept and photographed, and so we can see quite a range of what people were thinking about, what people were thinking constituted town planning in the early 20th century. This is the Griffins plan, and it's the winner, and it's particularly remarkable, and it's not a great image, is it? But it's particularly remarkable in that it really uses a whole lot of the topography to show, to build. It builds the city in the topography, and you see those points of those lines that create that triangle, and then he's also, or they have also, created some circular lakes as well. Which ultimately, the lakes are not circular, but the lake is there. So that there's a whole kind of insertion of a very logical and systematical kind of design into the natural landscape. It's quite beautifully done in all kinds of ways. Now there's a body of thought which makes sense in a way that the ordinary idiots who saw this, who were judging this, they recognised some of its benefits, but they also looked at the circles and they said, circles, that's what we need, just like the Garden City is full of circles. So let's have circles everywhere and a few diagonals as well. That might have been some of the thinking, who knows. Into this world, and I'm not going to go into huge detail about this, but let's just say that the Griffins spend some time in Melbourne, actually. They're based in Melbourne. They're living at Eaglemont and travelling regularly to the Canberra site to help put their plan onto the ground, and they're making this happen. They're met by bureaucracy at every step. There's a lot of resentment. Like, who are these Americans? Why should we care? Why should we be instituting their silly plan? There's clearly a lot of hostility, which is, somewhat difficult now to glean the reasoning for. But by the end of the 19-teens, so almost 100 years ago, Walter Griffin is sacked from his position is made untenable and he resigns, but he's effectively sacked from the project. Oddly enough, you remember John Sulman? John Sulman steps in and says, well, if I get a knighthood, I will take this on, or on the understanding that I'll get a knighthood, I'm going to take this on and see this to a certain point. And Sulman comes in and makes, oversees the further, the sort of establishment of Canberra up to more or less the time when it can be opened by some visiting dignitary. Here's Sulman and his crew. You can see him there with his hands crossed. He's just like, I think he's actually doing this, my knighthood, I can smell it. And, yeah. So, I'm not going to talk about fish in a barrel. I could talk about Le Corbusier a bit. I just really just love showing this picture of Le Corbusier, who notoriously enjoyed painting in the nude and obviously didn't mind having his photograph taken while he was painting in the nude. Le Corbusier, it's a leap from the Griffins to Le Corbusier in one sense, but they have a significant crossover. Le Corbusier, you may or may not know, Swiss-born architect. He's these things. He has a way about him. He doesn't actually do too much in terms of amazing planning work. He does one thing, which I'll get to, which is probably his version of Getty's Tel Aviv. He does one thing, but he does have a lot of ideas that he promulgates and which are extremely influential. And I think we've all seen this kind of scenario, like in real life or in photographs, and whether we could trace it all back to Le Corbusier, maybe not. You could say that Le Corbusier's kind of, bull in a china shop kind of approach possibly spoilt this kind of idea as much as, for many people, as much as it made it attractive. But he's very much about simplifying life. He's very much about making life that much easier for everybody. Keeping various functions apart from each other, keeping work away from residences, keeping open space away from the houses, all of these kinds of things. He's very into open space. I mean, he loves the idea of open space, but it's often a very cultivated open space. It's big, open, empty, in a manner of speaking, grassed lawns. All of these kinds of things that we see a lot in, the same kind of rhetoric is used when in the building of the Housing Commission flats around Melbourne. Is like, yes, we're getting rid of a lot of homes, but we're freeing up so much open space for children to play. And mother can watch the children from the flat and see, she can surely, if one of the children, gets hit by a car or a cricket ball or gets snatched by some random, mother can be there in like 20 minutes, if the elevators are working. So, yes, I don't think that was part of anybody's plan. But, so these are the kinds of ideas. Like, he's very anti-street. He's all about separating the pedestrian and the motor vehicle. The motor vehicle is just coming into being in this 1920s period, and it's obviously the way of the future. You'll see also, you see this a lot in the images that people come up with for the future of the cities. A lot of aeroplanes, and that one looks like it's actually about to crash into something, but this is a little pre-9/11. But the there is often a sense that we'll be flying around. We'll be on a number of levels. So, you might be accessing your building from the ground. You might be landing on the roof and going down, who knows. Yes. So all of these ideas. The ideas of technology. The notion, which is a famous notion that Le Corbusier came up with, this term, presumably in French, not English, that the home should be a machine for living in. So, and we see that, I think a lot of the time we look at that and we go, he's really trying to make us, he's trying to turn us into automatons or robots or, soulless beings or something that we just like, go to work, punch in, punch out, whatever. But he saw it as a space to be as creative as you want it to be. That you just you take away all the pressures, the crappy things about living, and you could become a whole person at last. The year before last, I was in Paris. They've got a museum of architecture, and they have a replica of an apartment built by Le Corbusier, one of hundreds in one particular building. It's a full replica. I went in and I was amazed by how spacious it was, and of course it was beautiful. It was a 1930s modernist masterpiece, a wonderful place. And you do get a sense that in some ways he's completely maligned, and in other ways he's essentially saying we've got to demolish Paris and build this, which is. Let's face it, a little bit nuts. These are I'm sorry, those labels are in Portuguese. I can't explain that. It's something very strange going on. But the one thing that Le Corbusier ultimately does, which is really interesting, is that he, a little like, so Patrick Geddes, they tap him on the shoulder and say, Patrick, can you come and design Tel Aviv for us? We'd really appreciate it. And Geddes probably, I don't know that he wrote about this, but Geddes probably said, well, this is going to be my legacy. At last I'm getting asked to do something really major and really important and big, and you know, this is where all my ideas are going to you know, be nestled together in one, you know, actual real place. Same thing happened with Le Corbusier and Chandigarh. So Le Corbusier is actually one of 4 people working on Chandigarh, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the others shortly. But Chandigarh, which is a newly built capital of a state in India, is in some ways, at least in its conception, a whole lot of the big ideas that Le Corbusier had throughout his life. And you know, there's certainly the reality there is very different from, you know, La Vie Radieuse. Then again, it's not that much different. You know, it still has the grid aspects to it, even though within each grid block there's differences. It has that kind of density, but it also has significant open space, as you can see in this plan. All the green is, and there's all kinds of those kinds of elements where it can roll out onto the landscape and still be, you know, if you keep going down below the bottom there and you have all those empty areas there, those blocks, it can replicate and still be explicable as you go forward. Right. So some of the strong elements of modernist planning in the, let's say, in the 1930s. Forget Le Corbusier, he's not really a part of this conversation at this point. This is more like, particularly the USA, and also the high-end, you know, the middle and upper classes in Britain and Australia. When we start to see cul-de-sacs coming forward as something that people want to have, safe for children, and everybody has a car, ideally, and everybody drives, you know, directly to their home. A street hierarchy with main roads and the feeder roads and the tiny little streets and the cul-de-sacs, and a preference for lower density. The idea of, you know, you can make ideal settlements is quite unusual. All of these slides are going to be up on LMS, by the way, so you don't need to worry about caring about what I say. A lot of interest in aesthetics, a lot of ideas. You know, in some ways, the first few decades of town planning as a notion are a fight between surveying / engineering and architecture. Like, what is town planning? You know, who owns town planning? In this faculty, architecture wins, I suppose, because even though the faculty of architecture, building and planning has its origins in the engineering faculty, which gave birth to the architecture faculty, which gave birth to a town planning diploma in 1950, and, you know, which was adequately successful that it's now the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. We've kind of grown out through the architecture aspect. Some places, some institutions and some ways of seeing planning are quite different. Okay, and so if I can possibly speed up, which is perhaps impossible, I'm sorry, I'm just... I've got a bad, not only do I have this temporary illness, but I have a permanent illness of being interested in things, interested in this stuff. Sorry, I just find it fascinating. I want to, as quickly as I can, talk about colonial cities. And so you think about, okay, so colonialism, it stretches back quite a way before the advent of town planning. But by the early 20th century, you have a strong sense that planning could and should be applied as you know, the gift of the old world to the new. Not so much in Australia necessarily, though there's still a bit of that, but it's like, particularly if you see planning, as so many did, as a kind of a cultivating force, and you see, you know, appropriate environment, and an appropriate built environment is going to make appropriate people, then there is that strong and strongly patronising sense that we can change people by changing their circumstances. So the pure colonial city, according to the author Anthony King, should be established at a distance from the founding metropolis, in overseas areas with a totally different economy, society and culture. Power in a colonial city is in the hands of a non-Indigenous minority. Well, of course, that's not the case in somewhere like Australia, but or for that matter, Canada or the USA. But let's move on. So the rights of the colonised are restricted. The minority is superior in military, technological and economic resources, and the colonised majority are ethnically different from the colonised, and this state of affairs is reinforced and extended with technology. Okay. Just for the hell of it, some comparative periods of colonial rule. Once again, poor old Australia doesn't fit on here, but I guess by Anthony King's sense of things, it's a different kind of colonised world in Australia. So, one of the main points of colonisation is to create places where primary products are produced and are shipped back to the centre of the particular empires for processing and manufacturing. So it's a primary industry place, and Australia certainly fits that bill in that regard until relatively recently. Here, in any case, is the world that's as colonised by Europe at some point. Not too many places escape that fate. But after 1900, when planning becomes a major force, there's this impulse to use planning and development of new cities, reordered cities, for greater control, let's say in the nicest possible way, or the nastiest, exploitation, hygiene, comfort, modernisation, trade and beauty. Here's a fairly horrible ad for soap that brings together at least a couple of these ideas, like the idea of hygiene and civilization in one place. Now you'll remember, at least I think you'll remember because I think I've talked about it, the Roman grid as a colonising force, and the Roman grid is not really even Roman. It goes back a long way before Roman times, but the notion of a grid coming through, like building a grid city or a grid town, making imposing your particular spatial idea onto a new place, and showing your power and ability, as well as creating a completely readable place for your colonising force. Often in Roman grids of smaller towns, particular places, particular amenities would be in particular parts of the town, wherever you were. So you may only have got to the town. Let's say you're a centurion. You only got to the town that day. You already know where the temple is or where the market is, because they're in roughly the same place in the Roman grid. That's not always the case, but it is often the case. But the grid is just kind of easy, isn't it? It's a simple way to do it. It makes sense in all kinds of ways. So in this country, that's what the colonial surveyors were doing in the mid-19th century. Someone would say, go to this riverbank and build us a town. Okay, how many squares do you want? And in the case of, for instance, Orange, you get that many. And it's carved up in that way. In the case of Melbourne, it is this much unusual because it's not a straight east, west, north, south grid. It's a grid placed on this particular little strip of the river that seems to run a particular direction, and you can put Flinders Street. A big part of Flinders Street can sit on that river bank and maximise your capacity for ships coming right up into the CBD. That, of course, changed quite quickly, but that was the original idea. So by less than 40 years later, you have a pretty extraordinary. There are the ships, by the way. A pretty extraordinary and remarkable place that shoots up super fast. Not so much for its the genius of building it the way it was built, but for the genius of someone finding gold in the hinterland in the 1850s. But nevertheless, it was it worked. And the grid goes on in Australia in the 19th century, for instance, Mildura, 1887. That takes it one step further, Mildura, because set up by Californians, as it was, they used the good old method of numbering the streets. So you're oriented even more than you are in places like Melbourne. You know that if you're in First Street, you're 4 blocks from 5th Street, or maybe 4th Street. I don't know. Anyway, you get the point. So I promised to speed up, so I'm going to try and speed up now, and I really only very briefly want to talk about Charles Reade in British Malaya and how Reade is brought in the 1930s, early 30s, I think, to I think I'm wrong, but maybe it's the 20s. Anyway, he's brought in to bring town planning to the people of Malaya, and to once again to kind of ratify and reinforce Malaya's status as a producer of primary products, mainly rubber. I don't think there's much more actually at this point. So he's in some senses a kind of a tool of the British Empire government there. He sets up a town planning exhibition at a part of Malaya called, I don't know how to say it actually, Ipoh, I-P-O-H, and he puts forward town planning as a commercial consideration, the best use of the land. The opportunities for town planning, he writes, denied to all countries still exist in a place like Malaya but may soon disappear. The time is opportune now for the further development and organisation of the existing town planning powers and machinery for securing needed and fast-seeing town improvement and town development works in accordance with modern practice. He talks a little bit about feng shui, but he also talks about the orderly arrangements of European streets, parks, open spaces, riverside avenues, and other evidences of considered forethought and care and development are in marked contrast to what he found in Malaysia as it was. So he produces a whole lot of plans remaking the kind of shambolic city as it was. As I say, he doesn't get far. He's not popular with the vested interests in Malaya, and he leaves for Zimbabwe, or what we now know as Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia, I think it was called then, soon afterwards. So there's little legacy on the ground of Reade in Malaya, but it's, I guess partly what I find fascinating about this is the rhetoric that people use. The planners coming into these colonial spaces and saying, "What a mess! Let's get this right now. Let's fix this, straighten this out, and make it work." And then, possibly they see a time in a few decades hence when they'll be out of there, but they will have done good in their minds. It becomes a kind of a cavalcade of extraordinary examples. Tsingtao, which is created by the Germans, who I've never really talked about, but who were seen in the 19th century as leaders in town planning, largely because they were so civic-minded and so into engineering in the planning sphere. A lot of sewage projects amongst the Germans. So alleys, gardens, trees, and the brewing, which made a big difference. Places like this one, sometimes known as Dairen, sometimes known as Dalny, a town that, if I remember correctly, is created by the Russians, and it's if I remember rightly, and I may not, because I often don't, the word Dalny, which is the Russian name for the town, just means something like really far away. It's it's right at the, very distant, far distant, and it is from Moscow, quite close to part of Russia, though. One of the things that interests me most about this plan, which is an early plan, the strict distinction, the European town here and the Chinese town. This is a place in China. So the Chinese live on the other side of this park, in this little place, and the Europeans live in the villa residences here on in the big spacious area. The whole story of this place is one of change, and it becomes Japanese territory in the years of when the Japanese invade Manchuria and create the puppet state of Manchukuo, and they take this over. This little YouTube video, which I'm not going to show you, but it's worth having a look at, is called something like that, Manchukuo. It has some newsreel footage of Dalny, by this stage known, I think, as Dairen, and it's a really interesting piece of footage. I'm not going to talk about Lusaka. I'm not even really going to talk about South Africa. The reason that I was interested in South Africa, I think in part, or in Africa generally, was that we see so much of this kind of remaking of the city to, in this instance, you can see here as well, if you know any French, the indigenous quarter here. So the city is set up so that Europeans live in one part and the colonisers live in one part. It's usually the nicest part, and the here we have it again, the vie indigene, where the local people live, and it's like the Nolan plan for Venice all over again, except it's at least the indigenous people. At least they're not in some little separate, little strange place over to one side. In this instance, I think it's the old town that has been set aside for them as too cramped for European or the colonising forces. There's also an aspect which is important to bear in mind, is the appropriation of local aesthetics to win the affection of the natives. Whether that worked is another question. Anyway, let's just move on quickly. Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry are two of the people who worked on Chandigarh with Le Corbusier, and before that time they were helping to facilitate the last gasp of Britain to establish or justify its ownership of enormous areas of Africa, and they were out there in the tropics doing a lot of research and making a lot of proposals about how cities could be rational, or towns could be rationalised and made usable and useful and efficient. The kinds of facilities that could be or should be built, the kind of housing that people should live in, the kind of sanitation they should have, prescriptions about the kind of life that they should live, the kind of toilets they should have, the kind of bus shelters they should have, and in this instance, the way that particular towns could be remade to be more, as I say, efficient and usable and straightforward. Once again, none of this stuff came to pass. Drew and Fry are very well respected for their work. They're English. They're from I think they're from the University of Liverpool. They have a kind of background in that formative town planning area. They're also architects. They are really important in lots of ways, but they are also totally ineffectual in this part. And I think in this sense, possibly, in this sense, on the wrong side of history. It's hard to come down too hard on them in this case, but nevertheless, it was wasted effort ultimately. Except I assume they got paid. So, Le Corbusier drew Fry and one other man whose name I can't remember in Chandigarh. Quick revisit to Getty's. Getty's is in India from 1915. Getty's has a cities and town planning exhibition. In just before the First World War, he takes his exhibition to Dublin, and it's reconstituted because the ship that it was on is torpedoed and it all sinks to the bottom. He makes it again, goes to Dublin. He meets there with Nolan. He and Nolan and Raymond Unwin are brought in to judge a town plan for Dublin, which they do. The plan itself is rather sumptuous. It never comes to pass, which is, of course, the story of 99% of planning. It never comes to pass because Ireland secedes, I suppose you'd call it, from Britain, and the Irish have no money, even if they wanted to institute this kind of essentially colonial plan. Nevertheless, he then takes his town planning exhibition to India, and he starts travelling India and creating these designs where he can. I think I showed you this image before. He talks a lot about these kinds of open spaces, as I said, for hygiene. He talks about, he understands much better than most the caste systems and the kinship systems of India. He takes time to figure out how the society works, how poor people might need to live nearby rich people who they work for. They may have long-standing associations with, relationships with, of employment and possibly other things. And he's very critical of the British in India and the way that they behave, and they ride roughshod over ancient tradition in this place. I mean, I'm not saying that he's a hero, just that he's a different kind of figure to most of the colonial planners of this period. And as I mentioned, I believe here he is actually spending time with an Indian man. I have no idea who this man is. That's Getty's there on the left. I seem to have a bit of a fixation on Getty's and finding photographs of him. Sorry about that. In Israel, we have some very low-key, early attempts at instituting a new kind. Well, it's not Israel yet. In Palestine, low-key attempts to create things that reference the notion of the garden suburb. Here's one that does actually take a little fragment out of that Ebenezer Howard garden suburb idea and tries to put it into a particular township. It doesn't really work. And here's Getty's Tel Aviv, and here's some of the spaces that he created. This is from my visit. Sadly, I think these spaces are seen appropriately as very useful to put bomb shelters in, which I think that's what that is. Certainly, it's some kind of communal place that you all have to go when the city's being shelled, which doesn't happen that often, but you've got to be ready for it. But it's also a place with little kiosks and places where you can play chess and so on. Rather beautiful spaces, as you can see, very leafy and green. I think I might just very quickly mention the notion of the cordon sanitaire and the notion of the hygiene. I mentioned the white man's burden. I'm sure you're all aware of the apartheid system in South Africa, and to start with, let's just quickly talk about this idea of hygiene and disease transmission and the notion of creating planning spaces that are, empty spaces that are it's often a case of not only this idea of hygiene that, I guess the European colonisers could catch illnesses or diseases from the natives, which is actually pretty contentious, you'd be surprised to hear, but also that these could be very, places of control, very easily delineated places so that the, stay in the Indigenous quarter, if the African people, if we're talking about African places, need to stay in their Indigenous areas, and the colonised people stay in their colonised spaces. I don't want to go a long way into South Africa, and it sort of feels like you need more. You need more time to give it the emphasis that it deserves, and I don't have that time. But I think that it's worth bearing in mind that for a long time in this nation, for decades, planners were required to come in and institute planning, especially formulated planning practices that are essentially zoning to keep races separate from each other. These images, rather remarkable images about a park bench for white people only, a stairwell for black people only. All of these kinds of basically replicated facilities in particular cities that separate the races. And of course, this is not per se a colonising story. It has its origins in colonialism, but South Africa by the second half of the 20th century is not a colony, or even the first half, but it has that genesis and so on. Easy to come down hard on South Africans and South Africans of the past, 20 plus years ago, and say that white South Africans were terrible people. They certainly did some terrible things, but we have the American segregation story, which I alluded to earlier with Nolan et al., and we also, of course, have similar situations in Australia to the present day, in fact, but also this is one of many images, great images from the freedom rides in outback New South Wales in, I think, 1965, February 1965, when students from the University of Sydney go out into the outback and they bring media attention to situations where Aboriginal people in particular are refused entry to various places, sometimes officially, and are essentially segregated within the amenities in particular towns. So, that is an odd place to end, but I'm going to end, and I will tell you this important information, which is just going to be like, you are going to be so happy. Not only are you happy because the lecture's over, but also because the readers are available from the bookshop. Can you believe it? It's like the drought has broken. We have readers. So there are readers, and you can read. You can finally read. You've got something to read. You can stop looking at your phone, and you can go and read some reader material. So I guess I feel obliged to wrap this up. I will say this: one of the things that we're often told that we have to impart to you all in this subject is the notion of ethics, and I think that a lot of what I've covered here, I hope, gives you some sense of where the planner can potentially be, led astray, or where the planner might be complicit in something that ultimately is not necessarily a marvellous idea, or actually a really terrible idea. But there are all kinds of ways that the blind application of just straight up method and ingredients of planning ideas, you really need to be thinking back to, like, in whose service is this, who's in control here, and who's making these decisions. But I'll leave it at that, and we'll talk next week. Thank you very much.